Hello, good afternoon. I'm Susan Gzesh. I'm Director of the Human Rights Program here at the University of Chicago. Before we start with our two speakers, and we're going to reverse the order, first we will hear from Scott Horton because he had some video he was going to show us, and then we will hear from Marianne Case. I'm going to take the chair's prerogative to do two very quick things. First of all, I would like to remember Dr. Robert Kirshner, who was a world-renowned forensic pathologist, one of the founders of the Human Rights Program here at the University of Chicago, who died 4 years ago, who worked on everything from the El Mozote massacre to the Southside police torture cases that Lieutenant John Burge perpetrated, and was really an advocate of the cooperation between the academy and advocacy communities, and he would have been delighted with this conference, and we're very sorry he's no longer with us. One of the civil rights lawyers in Chicago asked me at Dr. Kirshner's funeral, did we have any other forensic pathologists like that at the University of Chicago? And I said, unfortunately, no. So I wanted to note his contributions to the field, which included being a founder of Physicians for Human Rights and one of the original authors of the Istanbul Accords, which brought science to human rights by developing medical standards for the diagnosis of torture. So I just wanted to say something about Dr. Kirshner in the context of this conference. I wouldn't be here if it weren't for Bob Kirshner and the other people who founded the Human Rights Program here. The second thing I want to do, since we're talking about the media and social discourse, and because I was told we have 10 minutes more than the other panels, is tell a joke. And it's a very fast joke, and I think it will give us a little bit, when things are very grim, sometimes it's a good idea to have something to laugh at. So this is a story of 3 police departments, and you could pick pretty much any 3 countries in the world. The third one is always whoever the, sort of low guy is in a particular region. If it were Scandinavian, it would be the Norwegians. But the context I heard this in was from some lawyer colleagues of mine in Mexico, so I'll proceed with that. It's a contest among police forces to find a rabbit in an acre of woods. And the first police force to compete are the Germans. And they come in and they have the entire forest mapped. They know where every tree is, every branch. They know how fast rabbits run. They have everything calculated down to the, minutest detail. And they go into the forest, the German police, and about 45 minutes later, they come out with a rabbit. The judges tell them very good, and then the Americans come in. The Americans have every technological device you can imagine. They have night sensors, they have motion detectors, they have infrared cameras. They go into the forest, and 40 minutes later, they come out with a rabbit. Show it to the judges, very good. Then the Mexicans show up. They don't have very many technological devices. They go into the forest. 2 hours later, they come out dragging an elephant. The elephant is streaming water from his trunk. He's got cigarette burns all over his hide. And the chief of police drags him up in front of the judges. And the judges are looking rather puzzled. And the Mexican chief of police smacks the elephant across the face. And he says, "Tell them who you really are." So, popular culture includes jokes. It also includes media. And Scott Horton, who has left the practice of law to work full-time as a writer and teacher because he has gotten very involved in these issues over the last number of years, is going to start us out by looking at some of what's in the media about the topic of torture.
And we're going to start with a clip that's going to have some very, very brief interview segments, and then we're going to see some key passages from Fox News' 24, which has been referred to repeatedly, because I think it's very important for all of us to have a very clear idea visually of what goes into these programs. So why don't we go to the video.
And you see Americans torturing. And the Americans who torture are seen as patriotic, they're seen as effective, they're seen as heroic.
I think interrogators, they wanted to see themselves as these rough, tough action heroes that you see on TV, the kind of interrogator like Kiefer Sutherland.
It used to be that only villains tortured people, and they tortured good guys. Today, you have Americans doing the torturing.
Those men will kill your family if you don't tell me where the bomb is now.
How would I characterize television and techniques? They're using techniques that really don't work, but on television they make you think that they work.
I can't wait any longer. Tell me where the bomb is or I will kill Stein.
If you're bombarded with thousands of hours of television where all you see is these extraordinary techniques, you're a young person, maybe you haven't received a lot of training, and you say, well, I've seen this, surely it must work. I've seen it 20 times on television.
Tell me where the bomb is! Tell me where the bomb is! Fine. Tell him.
There have been many, an individual who has been willing to die and not reveal the information they know, especially when we're dealing with these true believers.
You're running out of time. I will tell these men to kill your last son. Where is the bomb? That's it. Take him out. I tell you. Tell me now. What's the plan?
In fact, what it does is it pisses them off.
I want you to know we didn't kill your son. We staged it.
And it makes them more resolute.
Obviously, if people are talking about beating someone with a phone book because it doesn't leave marks, or they're talking about using the field phone as a generator to create electric shock, these aren't things they thought of themselves. They're things that they got from television.
I think you've never actually tortured anybody in your life.
Unfortunately for us both, you're wrong.
I think that TV shows and movies really misrepresent the way interrogation works. It always seems that the interrogator on TV leans in on the subject, and then the subject clearly breaks, and this happens in less than 5 minutes.
Perhaps losing an eye will loosen your tongue. Okay!
And then once the subject is broken, he's broken, and he'll tell anything that the interrogator wants him to. I mean, the few times that I saw prisoners actually break in Iraq, that wasn't the way it happened. It happened very slowly by building a relationship between the interrogator and the subject.
We don't want anything to be less compelling. We don't want to undermine the entertainment value, which is what these shows' primary purpose is. It's entertainment. But we do want screenwriters to understand that there's a consequence to some of this in today's world. Torture used to be seen by Americans as absolutely unacceptable. Americans did not torture. And the depiction of torture on television and the idea that torture is okay in certain circumstances has become more commonplace.
The Parents Television Council has seen a huge spike in depictions of torture on television, especially after 2001. From 1995 until 2001, we found minimal depictions of torture. Post-2001, there was a huge spike. It topped off in 2003 at over 200 instances per year.
It was constantly before us the notion that we needed to get information to save lives.
Tell me what you know about the Helix Protocol.
Everything became a different timeline scenario.
It's too late. You can't stop this.
People believed that every Iraqi had something to tell us. Every Iraqi knew something about the insurgency. And if they told us they didn't know anything, you could assume they're lying, and then you just want to keep pushing and pushing.
And so, with unclear guidelines, with confusion, with people doing jobs they weren't trained for, soldiers are feeling this pressure, and they're resorting to techniques they've seen on TV.
I'm actually hoping you don't tell us what we need to know.
We would encourage screenwriters to think about the impact of these scenes when viewed overseas. Wait! And to think about that this culture gets exported. And if there are ways for Hollywood to have a more nuanced view of torture.
White. Tell her to cut the white wire.
We would really welcome the chance to talk to Hollywood about that and to have them take that on.
Give us just a
Is that piece from Human Rights First?
Yes. But this is principal. Yeah, in fact, this is an excerpt I took out of a longer DVD, which runs about 25 minutes, which has a great deal more narration and many more segments from several different shows, principally 24, but a number of others as well. If you want to get a copy, contact me. I'd be happy to get one to you, right? So I want to talk, I want to bring the focus to the media now, and maybe I should just start by asking, what sort of impact does this have, programs like 24? I'm going to come back at the end and talk about the effects, but I want to start with just one, and that is something I think of concern to law students and law school professors. Antonin Scalia, certainly an intellectually powerful member of the Supreme Court. In the course of the last 18 months, 2 times has made public statements, once in Canada, once in an interview with the BBC, in which he has stated that his attitudes towards the torture issue are strongly influenced by Jack Bauer, who he cites by name. In fact, he says it creates a clear paradigm for addressing the issue, and he says, what prosecutor, in this BBC interview, what prosecutor would ever dare to bring charges against Jack Bauer? I think it shows how really remarkably powerful this has been. Most of our discussion of torture is focused on policy formation and debate, and we've seen the issues tackled from the perspective of law, of ethics, the utilitarian stance. We really, and I think the focus of that discussion has really been on Washington and the Congress, the think tanks, academia, the courts, the administration itself internally. And in this process, we're ignoring what is at least as important an alternate forum, and that is the media itself, which shapes public opinion on these issues in a very dramatic way. I want to start by talking just a little bit about the news sector, and I would obviously break this into 2 parts. There's news, and then there's entertainment. Most of my remarks are going to be focused on entertainment. It's astonishing, frankly, that we're talking about torture in the context of entertainment, but that's the case ultimately. Well, let's start with the news sector. And news coverage of torture as an identifiable issue, of course, it stretches way back in the United States. I mean, people who've looked at it have documented lots of discussion in American newspapers at the end of the Civil War, around 1902, 1903. There was a great deal of it. But more recently, it's been after the publication of the Abu Ghraib photographs in April 2004. They were published originally in The New Yorker and on CBS's 60 Minutes. There are a handful of reports that predated that. They really didn't get a lot of attention. At the time the Abu Ghraib images broke onto the public scene, I had completed a major study by the New York City Bar Association looking into the legal standards governing highly coercive interrogation practices. And we had taken up that study because the Bar Association had been contacted by very senior officers of the JAG Corps, and we had been told, there was no question about it, that torture techniques were in fact being used by the administration, which was misleading the public about what was being done. They were aware of it. In fact, they described how JAG officers have been consciously circumvented in this process because of the objections they raised to it. And as a result of that, we undertook, and we did, about a 300-page study of the legal rules on these coercive techniques. And I spoke out frequently. I was interviewed by all the networks, by Bill Moyers, a number of others. And one thing I kept noticing when I would talk about this is whenever I use the word torture, I would be cautioned. You realize, of course, we can't use that segment. Why? Or I was told by one of the cable news networks, well, we could only put that into the international feed. It's not for domestic consumption. And then I was told that, well, if you want to discuss this, you have to use other words. You cannot use the word torture. So highly coercive techniques, yes, that's fine, something of that sort, but not the word torture. Why? In fact, I kept pressing that question over and over again. Why? Because the administration, of course, the mantra that was coming from President Bush at this time was, we do not torture. And of course, anyone saying the contrary was directly contradicting the President of the United States. And as one executive told me, that's a gutsy thing for us to do. We don't do it. So I think that this had a really remarkable impact on the way the news coverage of this issue occurred, particularly in the first half year, that is, to the end of 2004 and the beginning of 2005. Now, torture. Of course, I don't think that all the techniques that were used constitute torture, but I'll pull out the ones that we at the Bar Association focused on that we believe are torture. Waterboarding, long time standing, hypothermia, sleep deprivation in excess of 2 days, the use of psychotropic drugs, and the sensory deprivation, sensory overload techniques that were first developed for the CIA at McGill University. We've concluded legally all those things are torture. In our study, we went back and we started looking at American legal assessments of the use of these techniques by other nations. The U.S. had no compunction saying these things were torture. It did repeatedly. Waterboarding, by the way, my former law partner, Michael Mukasey, of course, has testified several times before Congress saying that he's not sure if waterboarding is torture. I am sure that waterboarding is torture. In fact, we have court-martials of people who used the waterboarding technique going back to 1902, 1903. And indeed, we can look to highly progressive liberal jurisdictions like the Supreme Court of Mississippi, which in 1926 handed down an opinion saying that waterboarding was torture. So there's really, no issue whatsoever about it. And I think we only get these conclusions from the Office of Legal Counsel by a failure to examine dispositive authority, which is something they've been quite expert at for the last several years. And I think, of course, the use of the word torture to refer to those techniques in particular is appropriate. Now, when we go back and look at print media, I think in 2005 I sat down one weekend and I went through the New York Times over a period of 4 months to see how the word torture had been used. And I found it was used to describe accessorizing clothing that clashed. It was used to describe a neighbor's excessively loud stereo music. But when we came to look at torture techniques being used at that point at Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo, the word torture would never appear, at most in scare quotes. But even that's quite infrequently. Usually you would see the words highly coercive. I mean, this is, in my mind, a rather stunning example of the process that George Orwell referred to in Politics in the English Language in 1946, where words are stripped of their real meaning. They're given a false meaning, and I think we see that very, very clearly here. Now, in early 2005, I also had several meetings with Alex Gibney, who was working on a project to do a documentary about this, and I worked with him for the last 2 years on that project, which ultimately produced the documentary Taxi to the Dark Side. And when we looked at it, I told him immediately, let's not do a documentary about Abu Ghraib. The whole tactic that the administration has taken has been, this is an Abu Ghraib problem, it is the Abu Ghraib problem. It's Animal House on the night shift, the phrase that got memorialized as a result of that. I said, let's look at something else. We focused in this documentary on a death that occurred at Bagram Air Force Base in Afghanistan. In fact, one of the first reported deaths in detention. And we were able to show in this process that that there was a conscious decision to lie about what occurred, false certificates were issued, but we were able to unturn, mostly due to fantastic investigative work by the New York Times, Carlotta Gall and Tim Golden, exactly what happened, how this death occurred, and link it directly back to decisions that were made in Washington. That the chain is amazingly clear. And one of the real bombshells in the documentary is we have a secret video that was taken of a group of senior commanders conferring in Bagram Air Force Base, in which they're talking about the fact that the Pentagon has directed the use of these techniques, and we are supposed to lie about it. We're not supposed to allow people to know that this is going on. Of course, I think that's all abundantly clear as a result of documents that subsequently came up. Well, response to the Abu Ghraib scandal can be really summarized as let's scapegoat the grunts. So unnamed Defense Department spokesman spoke on not-for-attribution basis to Pentagon reporters in the weeks right after the New Yorker and 60 Minutes aired, and they gave the same sort of background briefing over and over again. Well, this is a particular unit that came from the foothills of Appalachia. They were all hillbillies. A number of them had criminal records. Sorry, we really can't manage the level of quality control we need for today's Army. But that's it. It was these bad apples. And then Secretary James Schlesinger, former Department of Defense Secretary, led a study, high-level study. He came out with it, and he then made the rounds all around the country, summarizing his report, saying again, this was Animal House on the night shift. There was absolutely no connection to decisions that were made in the Pentagon. That was a conscious lie. And in fact, when we subsequently got the classified portions of his own report, we discovered it didn't say that. It said that, of course, there was a very clear connection between techniques that had been approved and authorized for use in Guantanamo and other places and the things that were being done at Abu Ghraib. So, of course, there was a policy which was fairly successfully implemented of conscious deceit. It wasn't totally successful because I think within the months after Abu Ghraib, a majority of the American public was not buying the line, but the administration was able to hold on to roughly 40% to 45% public acceptance of its line. And I think a lot of that has to do with the media not pushing things as aggressively as it should have. Well, when we completed Taxi, it was shown at the Tribeca Film Festival. It got Best Documentary there. It's a spectacular film. If you haven't seen it, you really need to. It's 2 hours. It's grueling. It will not be pleasant, but you will learn more than you could learn at this entire conference in this film. And it got very, very wide critical acclaim immediately. But I said it was unpleasant. We got overtures from Discovery Channel, which said, you know, we love it. We really would like to get this work and put it on TV. We concluded a deal with Discovery, and we were told this is going to show in the spring. Then about 2 months ago, strange things started happening. First, the Motion Picture Academy notified us that they disapproved the artwork for the documentary because it showed a man wearing a hood. And that, in their mind, was associated with torture. And they certainly couldn't allow images associated with torture to appear on a poster. Well, there was actually quite an explosion, even within the Academy, about that, and after a month and a half they pulled back, and that was okay. But then we started hearing from Discovery that they were feeling strong blowback from sources that they didn't want to identify, and they decided it would be imprudent to show this documentary. So we were notified that it was going to be put on the shelf, and it might be shown sometime after the elections, maybe in early 2009. It's pretty clear that there was political pressure brought to bear on them, and when that news came out, there was also quite an explosion publicly, and just 48 hours before the Academy Awards, at which Alex got the Oscar for Best Documentary, of course, Discovery flipped this to HBO. But I think this shows you pretty clearly the sorts of things that have been going on in the news side. Now I want to flip over to the entertainment area, and I want to talk about what's happened there. You remember the Parents Television Council with the statistics on the number of torture incidents that have occurred, where we saw, basically very, very few incidents of torture after 9/11. It begins to mushroom. It peaked in 2003. It's been dropping a little bit. Actually, we're seeing in 2006 and 2007, we're seeing it crest back up again, so it's no longer trending down. But the most disturbing thing is that there's a rather dramatic shift in the nature of torture incidents that are portrayed. So if we go back and we look at the historical Hollywood take on torture, great example is 13 Rue Madeleine, a film that came out in 1947. One of maybe 24 films made in the World War II era that show torture, quite typical of what happens Torture is the tool of the enemy. Indeed, there was a propaganda poster issued by the U.S. government during the war that says, torture, tool of the enemy. It was used to identify the enemy. The victims, Americans and allies of the Americans. Does torture work? Torture never works. Torture shows the weakness of our enemy, and we will be resolute in opposing it. We will gain strength from it, and we will overcome them. This is the subtext that appears in that movie and a series of others. Now, when we jump forward to the modern treatment, particularly 24, what do we see? Well, we see a reality show that has remarkably little to do with reality. It grossly simplifies complex facts. It pares away critical factors, which a responsible citizen should be thinking about. And more importantly, it really constitutes a head-on attack on morality and ethics. In fact, I had a meeting just in the last couple of weeks with the leaders of two major churches who told me that they were contemplating a campaign against Fox and 24, as one of them told me, this is a direct assault on the religious teachings of our church. They constantly present those teachings in terms of political figures who are naive, arrogant liberals, but in fact, of course, these may very well be religious teachings that are common to most faiths practiced in the United States. And key to 24's success is a ticking bomb scenario. You hear it everywhere. It's in the lead-ins, it's in the commercial breaks all the time, that pulsating sound. It's adrenaline pumping. And that tells us, of course, the myth of the ticking bomb is the core of the program. It's built completely around that. Torture always works. Torture always saves the day. Torture is an ultimate act of heroism. It is an act of defiance of pointy-headed liberal morality in favor of service to the greater good to the country and to the many. So, first question I want to ask is, has this been done for a political purpose? Has it been done to create a more receptive public audience for the administration's torture policies? And I think we have a pretty clear answer to that, and the answer is yes, quite consciously. And I want to refer you to Whatever It Takes, an article by Jane Mayer, one of the best pieces of expose journalism published last year, in which she looked at the process that led to the evolution of 24 and discovered it involved the interaction, surprisingly or not surprisingly, of a large number of people from the staff of Vice President Richard Cheney. Now, when we study the evolution of this policy within the Bush administration, very, very clear where the impetus, where the force for the introduction of these policies came. We took the words dark side and taxi to the dark side from remarks that Dick Cheney made before Meet the Press in an interview. We know that during this period he was very aggressively pushing the introduction of these techniques on the CIA. They were actually resisting, I think, as Eric pointed out a little bit earlier, resisting very strongly the use of these techniques. They had to be crammed down to bring them in. And the producer, Mr. Cernow, is proud of the fact that he's building popular support for the administration in what must be its single most controversial policy. I think what he's doing essentially is he's building off of a Hollywood legacy, what I call the Rambo legacy. And the Rambo legacy, again, it focuses on a big gap between reality and this fictitious world in which superheroes accomplish good things, frequently using terrible techniques. So I think, the obvious criticisms that need to be made, we discussed most of them at the conference so far. The first one is, is the ticking bomb scenario real? Does it reflect something that actually occurs in life? I believe it's a malicious fiction. I don't think it's ever occurred. I think it's highly improbable it ever would occur, particularly when you think of all the facts that people would know absolutely that there is this bomb and that this person has the answer, and then that the application of torture is going to get you the answer and allow you to save a city or save humanity. But moreover, when we look the next step, this technique, this scenario is being used to justify application of torture techniques in a far broader situation. Look at the testimony just a couple of weeks ago by Stephen Bradbury before the House Judiciary Committee, when he described the 3 incidences in which waterboarding had in fact been applied. In none of these cases did we see a ticking bomb scenario or anything like it. Next, the reliability of torture. Eric saying, we really don't know, does it work or does it not work? That's a convenient argument to make. However, this issue has been studied for many, many years by experts. And I would submit Eric is not an expert. Is Eric here? Eric is not an expert, and Eric has not taken the time to examine the expert materials that have been presented. Well, let me tell you, the Intelligence Science Board looked at this question extensively in 2006 and referred to the ticking bomb scenario in 24 and essentially said what I said, that this is not realistic. And that even if such a scenario were to occur, the idea that torture techniques would produce correct answers to resolve the situation is not realistic. So I think a good example, if we look at what's happened in the last 5 years, is Colin Powell and the speech he made before the Security Council. Momentous event. He justified the invasion of Iraq. He justified it relying in substantial part on evidence that was taken by a man named al-Libi, who had been tortured, who said that Iraq was busily at work on a weapons of mass destruction program. And this information was totally incorrect. And Powell, in fact, subsequently said this was the most embarrassing day of his life. So that, I think, is the consequence of relying on torture-extracted evidence. There tends to be a rush to believe that it's true because torture was applied. And it has certainly no more likely to be true than interrogation without torture. Containment is another issue. Can you introduce torture and use it only in a very narrowly defined set of circumstances like the ticking bomb, or does it not, in fact, metastasize and spread far more widely? And I think Darius Rejali has researched this extensively and quite brilliantly in a number of cases. I mean, going back from antiquity to the French experience in Algeria and so forth. The historical experience on this is quite clear that that containment is not likely, that it's highly corrosive. I think we also have to consider what is the effect of use of these techniques on a nation's reputation in the world, and what consequences does that have for your national security? Generations of Americans fought and bled to build a system of alliances around the world that are critical to our national security. And what we've seen in the course of the last 5, 6, 7 years is a very dramatic erosion of that network of support. I could give you a number of examples. One of them that really strikes me is Turkey, frankly. In the Middle East, it was a cornerstone ally for the United States. In 1999, I was in Istanbul working on the transaction. The NATO summit was going on. President Clinton came. There were the crowd swarming in the street, screaming his name. Popular support for the United States crested over 80% amongst the Turkish people. Today, most recently conducted poll shows that support for the Bush administration is within the margin of error. That's right. Support might actually be 0. And then we go on and we look at Italy, Spain, Germany, France, Britain, Japan. We're seeing the same. These have been key strategic allies for the United States. We're seeing the same phenomenon. And each of these cases, very, very clear that the U.S.'s reputation for using torture techniques has played a very important role in the dramatic collapse of popular support for the United States. The U.S. is not viewed as a leader. The U.S. is barely viewed as an ally. In fact, in many of these polls, you look at the U.S. side by side with the world's last Stalinist power, China, and the Chinese beat us out time and again. Distressing. And does this have effects, practically effects in the conduct of the war on terror? I've looked at this question in detail in connection with security planning in Afghanistan. And what I found was NATO allies who we brought into Afghanistan have great reservations about cooperating with the United States, particularly in the area of detention policy and sharing and sharing information and sharing prisoners because of this reputation. So we see very, very strong and clear harm. Damage to military morale and discipline, something not discussed here. Actually, Jane Mayer notes that the dean of West Point, Patrick Finnegan, made a trip out to Los Angeles to talk to the writers of 24, telling them, you don't seem to understand what you are doing to the Army right now. We have soldiers all over the place in Afghanistan and Iraq. They sit in their rec centers, they watch this, and they think, Jack Bauer does it, it must be okay. So there are now a long series of instances where we can directly link torture incidents to people having watched 24. It's not really refutable. It's very, very clear. The Army has repeatedly appealed to 24 to back off of this, to make clear that this is fictitious, that these things are not authorized. Unfortunately, we're not seeing much of a response from 24 on that. But I'm going to go back and talk a little bit about military morale and discipline. George Washington, not an inconsiderable figure in American history, was famous for his opposition to torture. He came to opposing torture as a military leader. He had been involved in the French and Indian Wars, in the wilderness. He records seeing brutal treatment of soldiers on both sides repeatedly. And instances of torture. And he found repeatedly soldiers who used these techniques were bad soldiers. They were disorderly, they were poorly disciplined, they couldn't be controlled. He didn't want them. So for him, exclusion of torture was an imperative to maintain discipline and morale of the Army. That was a rule that he introduced in 1776 at the Battle of Trenton. Seems to have disappeared a few years ago. But I think the weightiest link in this entire chain goes back to something that my friend Mark Danner wrote, and that is if you assemble a team of Madison Avenue's best in a room and you ask them to concoct a plan, a recruitment plan for Al-Qaeda, could they possibly have come up with anything as effective as what this did? And I think the answer is no, they couldn't have. In fact, the National Intelligence Estimate released last year tells us that Al-Qaeda is back up to or has exceeded the strength it achieved in 9/11. My belief is that the use and reliance on torture techniques plays a major role. It is used aggressively for recruitment. This much we have very well established. So the current season of 24, which is set to begin shortly, it features a Senate investigation looking into Jack Bauer. The senator is named Bain Air, by the way, Jane Mayer. And he's out after the hero, but Jack Bauer is going to defend himself brilliantly and is going to show up the investigating committee from the Senate in the end. At least that's the brief script we see from the Fox network. Well, I think what we're seeing going on in America today, in many respects, is an echo of the experience that France had during the Algerian conflict. It's not as severe as what France went through, but it has a lot of the same traits. And I recently read the Algerian Chronicles, Chronique Algérienne by Albert Camus, in which he's talking about this. He really has a very strong focus throughout his chronicles on torture and the torture narrative. And he saw a society in France that was polarized between conservatives, traditional liberals, and the left. And there was really no constituency to oppose to oppose torture, The right had embraced the cause of the colonials, and they justified their reach to harsh tactics. This was first justified by arguments that the barbarity of the people in Algeria justified treating them in ways that, well, we wouldn't use this in Europe, but for these barbarians, it's okay. By the way, that's almost exactly the same thing that de Tocqueville wrote in 1840, talking about the Algerian wars. The same argument, and he exposes it and discusses it. But then that was really not very satisfying. I mean, for a society that embraces liberty, equality, and fraternity, hard argument to make, I think. And what happened is, of course, France turned to the ticking bomb scenario. We see it developed and we see it spread throughout in the late 50s and early 60s. And Camus notes that the left is not able to muster arguments against terror either. They're, after all, very largely in the embrace of the Stalinists, which are using the same techniques. I mean, literally many of the same techniques that we're talking about using right now. But Camus himself really musters powerful arguments about this. I'm really impressed with the end of his book where he says, though it may be true that at least in history, values, be they of a nation or of humanity as a whole, do not survive unless we fight for them, neither combat nor force can alone suffice to justify them. Rather, it must be the other way. The fight must be justified and guided by those values. We must fight for the truth, and we must take care not to kill it with the very weapons we use in its defense. It is at this doubled price that we must pay in order that our words assume once more their proper power. And I think that's the fundamental dilemma that 24 dodges. I'm not in favor of censorship. I don't want to see 24 driven from the air. I would like to see it portray this issue in a realistic and fair way that develops all the issues that need to be explored by society. That's what we really should be demanding. Thank you.
Scott, do you want questions now, or?
I'm happy. Whatever you want to do, it's fine with me.
Well, we'll take.
Okay.
We'll take some questions now for Scott Horton. Yes.
I have a question which is about the depiction of, do you know anything about the depiction of arguments against torture? Because my observation, this goes to Jeff's point in a way, is that in fiction, to the extent you see the argument against torture, it's always the absolutist argument, or it's almost always the absolutist argument. And if you know, and I guess I think in a way, you just laid out a bunch of pragmatic arguments. And I guess I think that part of what's doing the damage is not just showing that, you know, cases where it works, but having the argument against it be the absolutist argument. And I think for a lot of people, they think, well, in the ticking time bomb scenario, I would be in favor of torture, so if the only argument is the absolutist argument, I'm against it, and then they see no other argument.
Well, yeah, I had about a little less than a month ago, I had a meeting with a group of Catholic bishops and with the senior leadership of the Presbyterian Church USA, and they've been looking at this issue for quite some time, each thinking independently of acting on this. And this is the major objection that they raise. I mean, it was not so much the torture scenes, it was the denigration and ridicule of the arguments against torture they found extremely offensive. Because what you saw were, you know, liberal political figures being presented as, you know, appealing for some sort of mercenary political reason, and a failure to recognize. I mean, in the case of the church, I mean, for instance, one Catholic bishop told me, you know, the teachings of the church are not at all ambiguous on this. This is intrinsic evil. There are not a lot of things in Catholic doctrine that are intrinsic evil. This is. The Presbyterians have a different way of approaching it, but they come to pretty much the same conclusion. And I think they really want to see the objections presented in a way that's fair and broad. Now, I focus mostly on what I call, you know, questions of efficacy and policy rather than morality. I think they're more focused on morality, but I think, you know, that is the key failing of 24, is that it doesn't present the criticism in a fair way.
Yes.
Minor point, but I think, but I'm hoping not horribly minor, which is the TV show Lost actually is very complicated on this count. It raises all of the objections, I think, and in particular raises the objection Marianne raised about the effect of torture on the personality of the torturer. So Saeed is actually treated as a damaged person by virtue of his actions. And what I'm wondering is whether this might be a larger point about fictional depictions of torture, even in cases in which there's some sort of macho enthusiasm for it. I don't know the show 24, but as I'm going over the cases in fiction and in television and movies that have it, it's very ambivalent, and the negative arguments are present.
Well, if you look at the statements that have been issued by the National Religious Coalition Against Torture, they're pretty clear. And if you look at the letter that was issued by the National Council on Catholic Bishops about 3 weeks ago, they're very clear every time saying every act of torture has two victims. The person against who it's perpetrated, the person...
The picture you give of the entertainment world, I'm not sure it's accurate. It might be accurate about one TV show, 24, but Lost, which I think is the other very prominent one on torture, I think it's best read as cutting in your direction. It's the damage done, it's the inaccuracy of the disclosure, consequentialist argument against it. I think that's the upshot.
Well, again, my point is not to say that these programs should be driven off the air or they have no role. I think it's a critical debate in our society. What's needed is an expansion of the...
I'm not being clear at all. I'm not saying that you're saying they should be driven off the air. I'm saying that your depiction of the entertainment market is incomplete because one of your examples goes the other way. Unless my interpretation of the show is wrong, and since I'm obsessed with the show.
Alias, you mean?
Lost.
Oh, Lost. Okay. No, in fact, I don't think. I think Lost has done a much better job on this. I also think Alias is better. I really focused my remarks on one particular show, 24.
Yes. Oh, sorry.
About this, I think that 24 is particularly interesting. I mean, I know the other shows, so my opinion is partial. The thing that 24 is particularly tricky is actually because there are also in it, there are some steps in the direction of a greater complexity. And I think this is why the show is actually a good TV product, because it's not simply propagandistic and simply ideologically and clear scenes in which the bad guys are really just bad guys and the good guys are just good guys. I mean, it's more complex than this. But I think that that's, for me, from a moral point of view, that's way more dangerous. Because clear propaganda products are easier to identify and discard. I mean, instead, like, people who have higher intellectual instruments and tools and capacity to, like, when there is a good artistic product and when some ambiguities are depicted, but not really a fair way, can't really prevent themselves from this kind of likings. And so I think that that's actually worse on behalf of 24.
Darius.
Scott, two things. One is that, if I'm not mistaken, some of the reports of the movies that went into this weren't just these cop true drama movies.
Yes.
The range of entertainment movies, I mean, I know we're talking about 24 and we all think that everybody looked at 24, but I mean, the guys up in Mosul, their inspiration was the Captain Picard Romulan torture scene from Next Generation.
Yes.
And so I think we need to understand that the entertainment thing goes considerably broader than just these true crime stories. I wonder if you could comment on that. The second one is, you didn't really talk about the news. I know you pushed that one off. You wanted to talk about this. But I wanted to kind of look at, there's something that's been puzzling me, and now that you're here, I'll ask you. In the last 2 or 3 years, the Army keeps on announcing finding Al-Qaeda torture chambers in Iraq. Right. And you'd think that they would be playing that one up, but it never gets into the media. And I'm just curious what their reticence is, because if all this stuff is happening, why not play that one?
Well, the first one's a lot easier to deal with. I mean, that is, of course, I focus on 24 here for obvious reasons. I mean, to me, it seems to sort of sum up lots of evils. And whereas I think the Romulan torture process is like a little bit harder to take on, but also police drama. I mean, police drama and police fiction is a very important source here of this sort of violence. And the council statistics that we used here were focused much more on the war setting. So it was sort of reality type war reporting, which is then very, very close. And if you look at the totals that were in that graph, 67 of the total come from 24. So it was, coming up close to 30% of the total number of incidents. Pretty astonishing, frankly. So it's much more intense in 24 than anything else. Now, what was the other? Oh, but we get different. I mean, I spent the spring of 2006. I spent most of the spring in Baghdad, and I spent some time looking at this issue. And actually, you get different public affairs officers taking different attitudes. So, Brigadier General Horst, who discovered a Ministry of the Interior torture facility, turned this into a big deal, and it did get media coverage. It's really pretty much the battlefield commander's decision whether they want to do it or not. Now, I talked to General Horst about this afterwards, and he told me he got intense grief from the Pentagon about having done that. Because, of course, the Ministry of the Interior is under, development contracts with the Department of Defense, and, there may have been money that came from the U.S. taxpayers that was used to set up these torture facilities, so the Pentagon didn't like that being covered. I mean, I think they're but, you know, I think, by the way, Horst is an absolutely fabulous officer. I think he's one of the best guys in Baghdad, and very conscientious and very concerned about this issue. And I think he's not alone. There are an awful lot of senior officers. I think General Petraeus, actually, on this issue is terrific. A number of the other commanders are as well. But you know, the public affairs policy is fixed more than anything by the Pentagon Public Affairs Office, and they seem to have made the decision that, you know, we just don't want talk about torture coming out of Iraq.
We can take one or two more questions. And if we don't have any, Scott.
I mean, I relied on this thought in my talk, but unempirically perhaps. But do you have a sense as to why people, say in Turkey, care about whether the U.S. tortures to the extent that the U.S. tortures, and or the other sorts of things? What is it that, if you have a sense as to how this portrays us in the rest of
I've spent a lot of time looking at that question. I mean, I interviewed a bunch of newspaper reporters in Istanbul about this, and you get very emotional reactions. I mean, they'll tell you, we looked to the United States and we respected the United States. You brought us Midnight Express, which exposed torture in American prisons. It was a traumatic thing for the Turks. Excuse me, the Turkish prisons, right, sorry about that. It was a traumatic thing for the Turks, but, and there was this immediate sort of patriotic rejection of it, but over time they absorbed it and they recognized that this criticism was right and it was good for us, and there was tremendous reform in the Turkish prison system, mostly a result of that movie and the criticism that was directed at them. So they viewed America's conduct, frankly, as a betrayal. You know, that here you are holding up this banner, and now we see that you're really bad guys. And also that it was being done to Muslims, frankly, is a terrible thing for them. I mean, I think they had, under Clinton had intervened in the Balkans in favor of the Kosovar minority and the Bosnians, and which were, of course, previously part of the Turkish Empire, the very tight connection. So I think he was viewed really as a heroic figure because of that. And now, you know, they saw this happening where, you know, Muslims are being tortured. I think it produced a very dramatic negative reaction.
Well, we want to thank Scott very much. And now we have Marianne Case, who flew on a red eye from Utah to be here with us today.
And endured from the conference participants I left in Utah infinite torture jokes about how the red eye was going to prepare me for this conference. No.
laptop to the side there so the microphone is, just don't block the mic.
Okay, so I actually think that Scott's and my presentation are beautiful bookends of one another, because of the two iconic entertainment images that most often get invoked in these debates recently, one is 24. I am going to embrace, in a way not usually done by the people I think of as my side of the torture debate, the other one, Animal House, and not just in its double secret probation aspect. I should say, by way of background, that this paper that I'm delivering here, I originally prepared and presented for a conference at the Netherlands Defense Academy on sexual abuse and exploitation of women in violent conflict. And it's one of the few papers that I've started and come out very differently in the end than where I started. So let me first set forth what I said in my abstract in that conference I was going to do, which I'm still going to do, and then talk about how the research caused me to change my conclusions. What I said I was going to be doing, and that my topic then and now is gender performance requirements of the U.S. military in the war on Islamic terrorism, was to be examining the fact that among the many disturbing reports emerging from a variety of venues at which the U.S. military has conducted interrogation of Islamic male detainees since December 2001 are those detailing exploitation of sexual and gender stereotypes and taboos as a central part of efforts to humiliate and degrade detainees. It appears from reports that female U.S. military personnel are often deliberately used in this process. The American military women in the Abu Ghraib photographs, especially Lindy England, leading a naked Iraqi male detainee on a leash, are the most well-known examples, but there are others, particularly in the interrogation process. They're less photogenic, but perhaps equally damaging. Army linguist Kyla Williams, for example, reports being told to say sexually humiliating things in Arabic to naked male prisoners. Other female military personnel at Guantanamo, perhaps also in Afghanistan and Iraq, were allegedly encouraged to degrade Muslim prisoners through forced cross-sex contact, through the exposure of their own, that is to say the female interrogators' naked bodies, or of the naked bodies of the detainees, or through touching of prisoners with items apparently soaked in menstrual blood. There have also clearly been attempts made to feminize the detainees themselves, for example, by keeping them naked, by forcing them to sexualized performance and positions, through threats of rape, simulated and actual rape with objects and perhaps also with penises, through use of women's underwear, including pink women's underwear being placed on detainees' heads at Abu Ghraib, and bras and other items of women's underwear being placed in their normal position on male detainees' bodies at Guantanamo. And what I was interested in doing is to consider ways in which these practices do gender-based harm, not only to the men who are their alleged targets, but to the military women involved, voluntarily or not, in carrying them out, as well as to women generally. And I'm using the term gender here to describe characteristics coded masculine or feminine, sometimes irrespective of and sometimes inflected by the sex, that is, the maleness or femaleness of the person displaying those characteristics. I should say at the outset, since the technical definition of torture has been an issue here, that the practices I've just described are by and large not technically legally torture. What they are technically and legally is degrading treatment, which is prohibited in literally the same breath as torture in a bunch of laws, for example, the European Convention on Human Rights. And I should also say that, as you'll see, the analysis I came to develop applies well to actual things that are squarely within the definition of torture. I'll say a couple of things by caveat. First is I have done no original empirical work on this subject. I'm relying entirely on what has appeared in published sources, which are sketchy and incomplete, and which also suffer from a sort of echo chamber effect, in that one instance gets repeated through a variety of sources without it being made clear whether this is a unique or a representative example. And most of these sources are reporting second or third hand, including the reports of the various military commissions of inquiry, reports by journalists, by expert witnesses and lawyers for both the military perpetrators of alleged abuses and for the detainees. I have consulted as many first-person reports by military participants as I could find, including autobiographies by Janice Parkinski, by a female nurse at Abu Ghraib, by female soldier Kyla Williams. It's a book called I Love My Rifle More Than You. The source of that title I can talk about later, it's relevant. And autobiographies by 3 male interrogators, one each from Guantanamo, Afghanistan, and Iraq. You saw one of them on Scott's video excerpt. I've also read available first-person accounts by detainees. And in the end, as you'll see, my analysis came to be structured around 3 direct quotations from first-person accounts, 2 by interrogators, and the third by a detainee. The second caveat, I should say, is that neither torture, violent conflict, nor interrogation is my area of expertise. I have, however, had long expertise in the research of gendered norms, including norms of masculinity, and it's this cause of the many causes that Elizabeth Wood, for example, identifies, norms of masculinity, that's going to be at the core of my discussion. And my expertise there includes being an official observer of the integration of women at VMI, the Virginia Military Institute, a state-sponsored military academy, whose purpose was not to train professional soldiers, but to train citizens using military techniques. And these experiences came to seem much more relevant than I would have predicted in advance when I started this topic. I thought that I would be focusing more than in the end I'm going to be certainly in this presentation, although when I do deliver a version of the paper at a critical race theory conference in a week from now, the balance will shift a bit. Thought I would be focusing more than in the end I will on 2 things, both of which have to do with the othering of the detainees and a view of them as inferior and different. The first is that some similar practices have been reported in state prisons in the the United States, including the use of pink women's underwear to punish prisoners, to prevent theft of underwear, to single out detainees who were thought to be guilty of activities such as masturbation and the harassment of female prison guards. And among the many reasons to find prison practices particularly relevant is that it was reported that ringleaders among the soldiers at Abu Ghraib have prison guard experience. I also thought I would view as much more determinative and central than I now do the stereotyping of Muslims. Much of the reporting that has been done suggests that books such as one called The Arab Mind, written by cultural anthropologist Raphael Patai in 1976 and prominent on both the shelves and the reading lists of the US military, had led to assumptions concerning how Muslims, Muslim men in particular, would react to contact with women, to impugning of their sexual honor, to disgrace associated with nudity, and to challenges to masculinity. I'm not suggesting that these sources of models on how to treat the other are not relevant. But I came gradually and somewhat reluctantly to the conclusion that, in a sense, conservative commentators in the United States, such as Rush Limbaugh or Defense Secretary Rumsfeld, had an underappreciated point when they repeatedly said of what was reported to be happening at Abu Ghraib, embracing the line from the Schlesinger report that this was Animal House on the night shift. What these conservatives said, this is the sort of thing that happens all the time in fraternity hazing. It's the sort of thing that happens regularly in male-on-male contacts in the United States. In other words, it's not simply about treating the prisoners as the other. It is doing that to them what was done to us. Now, let me be clear about one thing. My agreement with Limbaugh and others is descriptive and not normative. The descriptive fact that the practices were common to frat hazing and to detainee treatment causes Limbaugh, for example, to think the treatment of detainees is nothing to worry about. But it confirms in me the conviction that we worry much more than we now do about hazing. And something that runs through my analysis is that practice after practice, especially the practices that males impose on other males, were the sort I was familiar with in my study of VMI, and that not only go on in frat hazing, but in boot camp, in military academies, and in the military to this day in the United States. Now, let me read very quickly, partly so quickly because I fear a lot of the people in the room can almost recite these by heart, the complete list of findings of abuse from the start of the Taguba report about Abu Ghraib. It says, the intentional abuse of detainees by military police personnel included the following acts: punching, slapping, and kicking detainees, jumping on their naked feet, videotaping and photographing naked male and female detainees, forcibly arranging detainees in various sexually explicit positions for photographing, forcing detainees to remove their clothing and keeping them naked, forcing naked male detainees to wear women's underwear, forcing groups of male detainees to masturbate themselves while being photographed and videotaped, arranging naked male detainees in a pile and jumping on them, positioning a naked detainee on a box and attaching wires to his fingers, toes, and penis to simulate electric torture, writing "I am a rapist" on the leg of a detainee alleged to have forcibly raped a 17-year-old detainee and then photographing him naked, placing a dog chain or strap around a naked detainee's neck and having a female soldier pose for a picture, having sex, a male MP guard having sex with a female detainee, using military working dogs without muzzles, and taking photographs of dead detainees. There's a subsequent list of less well-documented abuses. But let me just say, every single one of the sexualized practices, as well as nearly all of the others, the exceptions being the threats with dogs, is documented by such chroniclers of hazing as, for example, Hank Newer, who's the leading, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing his name correctly, but who's one of the leading chroniclers of hazing. Now, the quote that sums up this part of my analysis is from the words of one of the military interrogators in Afghanistan, a guy named Kavanaugh, reported in Chris Mackey's book. He says, and that's the title of my presentation, "You're telling me it's wrong to do to the prisoners what the Army does to its own soldiers?" Now, there's a couple of elements of this analysis. First, and this is, I think, much more relevant to the law conference than to the gender and critical race theory conference. This is partly a self-justificatory lawyering practice, right? So one of the things that Chris Mackey, the author of the book from which the quote is taken, said in a somewhat different context. He's talking about sleep deprivation. He says, quote, "I never wavered in my commitment to the conventions, but I did begin to say, how can we justify this? It was like confronting a tax question in the office back home. This is what we want the answer to be. The abiding theme of the convention is that you can never treat prisoners worse than you treat your own men. And it was in that interpretation that I saw some wiggle room for us." And this is exactly what Kavanaugh says in this context. He says, the context in which he made the quote, he says, prisoner was being a cocky fuck, so I put him in a stress position. And a commanding officer says, get him out of the stress position. Kavanaugh protests, saying he had put the prisoner in the exact same position that Army drill sergeants put young troops in when somebody screws up in boot camp. The same position drill sergeants had put him in. And then he said the quote. So some of the practices to which this analysis applies, we're already seeing, are not gendered practices. Kavanaugh was protesting stress positions. It also applies to forms of labor as punishment. For example, Tara McKelvey has gotten a lot of attention recently in, among other things, publicizing claims by a female Muslim detainee in Iraq that she was forced to burn large buckets of excrement, that this made her ill and made her feel degraded. But the burning of excrement is, in the first place, a necessary task for the army in the field, and secondly, one that is described as being assigned in that way, in the way that KP was in World War II, to men in the army as a routine low-level punishment for members of the military themselves. And this is also interestingly true of a lot of the sexualized violence. So compare, for example, recent accounts by and about Muslim detainees in the last few years with Anthony Swafford's autobiographical Jarhead, a Marine's Chronicle of the Gulf War and Other Battles, referring to the First Gulf War. Not only is Swafford, by his own account, punished with the task of burning excrement, threatened with branding while forcibly restrained by his fellow soldiers, he also goes into great detail concerning an activity for which he uses the term of art field fucking, which he defines as simulated sodomy perpetrated on someone in the unit who has transgressed in some way or was thought to be getting above himself. The victim of field fucking is held down, sometimes as at Abu Ghraib things are painted on his body. Fellow members of the unit proceeds to, it seems to only pretend, but pretend fairly convincingly, effectively, and dramatically to subject him to anal rape. And the field fucking incident that Swafford describes is performed in the presence of journalists during the First Gulf War. Similarly, Specialist Darby, who worked at Abu Ghraib, explained to reporter Anderson Cooper why he initially laughed when he saw a screensaver photograph of a pyramid of stacked naked men on a prison computer. He thought the naked men were fellow soldiers. Quote, I didn't realize it was Iraqis because we lived in prison cells too. I laughed and then I realized it was prisoners. They were forced to do it. Now I should note here that several of those who have criticized the use of the practices on detainees, which they still defend when used on fellow soldiers, have relied on the distinction that the detainees, quote, were forced to do it. This seems to me to overstate the freedom of the soldiers. Scholars of hazing have demonstrated exactly how rarely even participants in fraternity hazing feel free to leave. And soldiers are faced not only with physical retaliation from their comrades, but with legal retaliation, including imprisonment for crimes from insubordination to desertion if they seek to act on the assumption that they are free to leave or to demand that abuse perpetrated on them be stopped. On the other hand, a surprising number of sexualized practices inflicted on detainees were also engaged in by soldiers themselves in circumstances that do not seem at all coercive. Even such things as using fluorescent lights to threaten prisoners with genital mutilation are things that some of the U.S. soldiers did to themselves. For example, Charles Grainer, reportedly one of the ringleaders of the sexualized abuse at Abu Ghraib, reportedly poured fluorescent fluid from a broken light bulb on his own penis, as well as on those of detainees, exhibited himself as well as detainees nude and glowing, and photographed himself as well as the detainees in sexually explicit positions. So I think Susan Sontag is right when she says, quote, it is surely revealing as more Abu Ghraib photographs enter public view that torture photographs are interleaved with pornographic images of American soldiers having sex with one another, end quote. But it's not just revealing of the pornographic imagination. To me, it also reveals that treating the other like the self doesn't always translate into treating the other well. Rather than needing to imagine or learn from anthropologists of the Arab mind how sexualized abuse might make the detainees feel, soldiers could recollect how it made them feel. And the use of feminization as a means of disciplining, establishing rank, and breaking individuals down is something that's staggeringly common throughout the military. This brings me to the second of the three quotations around which I'm organizing my analysis, and this is from a detainee. He said of his treatment, and I'll give you a longer quote and the punchline comes at the end, they were trying to humiliate us, to break our pride. It's okay if they beat me, beatings don't hurt us, it's just a blow. But no one would want their manhood to be shattered. They wanted us to feel as though we were women, the way women feel. And this is the worst insult, to feel like a woman. Now, I have to say, when I gave this in Amsterdam, this was the comment that caused the gasp in the audience. This was the one I expected, frankly. Most of the commentator, not the gasp, this was not a surprise to me. Most of the commentators who focused on this comment have said that this reaction is particularly true of Muslims in the Arab world. But anyone who has looked at the way single-sex military academies in the U.S. traditionally treats recruits, regularly comparing them to women as a means of denigrating them, knows that being made to feel like a woman can also seem insulting and degrading to conventional American males. Indeed, a serious argument made by opponents of integrating women into the federal military academies and later into the Citadel and the Virginia Military Institute was that as a result of coeducation, these sorts of successful degradation practices would either be off limits or would cease to be effective. As Christine Littleton put it in her critique of the VMI adversative method's reliance on gender-based misogynistic epithets, quote, pity the poor drill instructor who screams, "What are you, a woman?" at a female rat. Now, I should say that the politically correct term that VMI is now applying to its cadets, the politically correct degradation, is maggots. It's politically acceptable because it's not gendered. I want to point out, though, that maggots is one letter off from faggots. A gendered epithets, it's something that people are often called by way of degradation. And I will also say that the conference in Amsterdam had military from all over the world, and one of the questions I said I was really interested in hearing about is how universal a practice it is among military to use comparisons to women as a form of denigration. And one of my fellow American academic participants reports to me that she was, when I asked this question, sitting in the midst of the Dutch contingent, cadets and faculty from the academy, and she says that they immediately said, "Oh no, we do not denigrate people by comparing them to women. We denigrate them by comparing them to homosexuals." I subsequently had discussions with Dutch gay activist friends who say that this may have something to do with the prevalence in Dutch of the slang term mietje, which comes from sodomite but has become deracinated in the way that things like geek have become, so that he says, even my, perfectly gay-friendly nephews will say in front of me, that makes me look like a mietje, not realizing the connection. But okay, so the denigration of soldiers themselves by comparison with women is something I think all of these men have experienced in their training and may be carrying over. Even something such as the suggestion given of female linguist Kyla Williams that she critiqued the detainees' sexual organs and sexual performance apparently comes out of SERE, Survival, Evasion, Resistance, and Escape training, that is to say the training given to the U.S. soldiers themselves. Now, one question I have is what difference does it make if women participate in this sexual humiliation? And on one level, some of the critics suggest it doesn't make much difference. So the title of one of the first collections of academic essays analyzing what's going on here is, quote, "One of the Guys," unquote. So when women are engaged in behavior like Lindy England's, it does not make that much difference to their behavior. I'll talk a little bit later about the ways in which it does make a difference. But first, let me consider not simply how abuse techniques are sexed, but how they're gendered. What both the communist bloc interrogation techniques, which SERE was originally designed to enable U.S. soldiers to resist, and the adversative training techniques prevalent in boot camp and at military academies have in common is the purpose and effect of breaking down the person subjected to them. This is seen to be useful in producing the abject submission that is a common goal of both Cold War communist interrogation and military unit cohesion, and for both a prelude to rebuilding a new man along new lines. But breaking down detainees is not or should not be the goal of interrogation on the War on Terror. Unlike prisoners of the North Koreans, of Stalin, or the Viet Cong, persons detained by the U.S. in the War on Terror serve no useful purpose when they make a false confession. What we want or should want from them is first and foremost reliable information, not submission. And those who have made the most detailed and systematic studies of the effectiveness of interrogation techniques seem to be in basic agreement that it's not the harshest techniques, but the gentler ones that have the best track record of producing reliable information. What emerges both from published first-person narratives from the interrogators in Abu Ghraib, Afghanistan, and Guantanamo bears out the commentators on effective interrogation techniques. Harsh techniques may be more tempting, they certainly may be more masculine, but the gentler techniques, fear down and ego up, are terms of art for two of them, have have been shown to be much more effective in eliciting accurate, useful information, and women are shown to be among the particular interrogators credited in each of these three situations with effective use of those techniques. Nevertheless, harsh techniques are in favor, both among policymakers, those handling detainees, and even over time among interrogators, including female interrogators who began by using gentler techniques effectively. The best explanation why is the third of the three quotations around which I've organized this analysis, also from an interrogator. Quote, "They'll think we're fucking pussies. We can't let them fuck us every time," unquote. Now, this is the flip side of feminization. Just as it is important to make the detainees feel like women, it is the worst thing in the world to feel or look like a woman yourself. On this, the Arab Muslim detainees and the American soldiers can agree. The statement, by the way, was made by an interrogator in Afghanistan in response to his superior officer's insistence that the interrogator stop imposing harsh stress positions on a detainee who had voiced hatred for America. Consistent with my argument that U.S. military personnel are using their own treatment as a model for their treatment of the prisoners, the interrogator's first line of defense when told you can't discipline prisoners for being glib is that the officer says, he says to the person reprimanding him, "You yourself made Carlson carry a pallet of water to the break room because he rolls his eyes at you at morning meetings." Only when the officer responds that, quote, "as the asshole sergeant," unquote, he can impose discipline on his men that interrogators may not on the detainees, does the interrogator make explicit his fear of feminization in the quote I just gave you. Now, the flip side of the problematic, the need to be perceived as masculine even at the cost of being effective, to value the appearance of strength over the reality, is also one that I'm familiar with my long study of gender in the United States. One of the things I looked at long ago in a study of the gendering of professions such as the police was the report of the Christopher Commission, whose purpose was to investigate and fix not sex and gender inequality, but violence in the LAPD in the aftermath of the Rodney King incident, in which I'm sure you all recall, members of the LAPD very severely beat a black suspect. Without having as their mandate either sex or gender, the Christopher Commission came back with a series of reports and recommendations that said, in effect, we have in the past constructed the role of police officer in a thoroughly masculine way. We seek to hire people who are aggressive. What we should want is good communicators. We seek them from the armed forces. We should seek them from among social workers. So the whole model of policing has been gendered masculine, and it might be more effective to have it gendered feminine. The very interesting response of the LA City Council was, great, let's hire more women. Let's have a goal or quota of 43% women on the force. But of course, the message of the Christopher Commission is not so much hire more women as value effective techniques gendered feminine and do not confuse masculinity with effectiveness. The lessons of the Christopher Commission have been lost in the war on terror, however. Ironically, the war on terror has taken a toll on the use of effective policing methods perceived to be feminine not only in the Middle East, but in the domestic policing context as well. So Susan Faludi reports, quote, "Penny Harrington, the first female police chief of Portland, Oregon, heard a recurring refrain as she made the rounds of as a consultant to regional police departments." The following quote is from an internal quote from Penny Harrington. "There was this attitude of, oh, we don't need the woman anymore. Among the repeat emotions she witnessed was, quote, rage in any woman who spoke out, unquote. Law enforcement agencies," she noted, "were also increasingly shifting funds from community policing, where many female officers had distinguished themselves, to the all-male counter-terrorist squads strapped with absurd amounts of firepower financed by the Department of Homeland Security." Similarly, the favored interrogation technique is not fear down or ego up, but a new technique called fear up harsh, with our harsh being the operative word. Now, this leads me to the most disturbing of the interrogation techniques to me as a theorist of sex and gender. There's a new technique developed apparently to exploit what were thought to be Muslim stereotypes. The term of art developed for it was, quote, invasion of space by female, unquote. In another Jane Meyer piece called The Memo, also from The New Yorker, she reports, for example, that, quote, a Saudi detainee, Mohammed al-Khatani, whom an FBI agent had identified as the missing 20th hijacker, had been stripped naked, straddled by taunting female guards in an exercise called invasion of space by female, forced to wear women's underwear on his head, to put on a bra, threatened by dogs, placed on a leash, and told that his mother was a whore. This technique, invasion of space by female, is the technique that the female interrogators who more explicitly sexualized their performance were engaging in. And what disturbs me is that this actually reinforces rather than undercuts what I understand to be Muslim stereotypes of women and of the West. That is to say, women are in the Muslim world already associated with fitna, with disorder, and Western women in particular are thought to behave like wanton prostitutes. As reporter Seymour Hersh put it, quote, they see us as a sexually perverse society, unquote. Even if the military is going to focus on exploiting Muslim stereotypes, whether true or false, invasion of space by female is a bizarre way to engage with those stereotypes, reinforcing rather than undercutting or disturbing the detainees' view of women and of the West. And I have to say also the feminizing, the making them feel like women is also likely to have counterproductive effects. The best, example of this I have is so far just fictional from the Yacubian building. But the Egyptian novel, The Yacubian Building, contains an example of an Egyptian, of someone detained by an Egyptian detained by the Egyptians, who is forced to behave like a woman while in prison. A victim of police torture says, quote, I'm dead now, they killed me in detention. When they trespass on your honor, laughing, when they give you a woman's name and make you answer with your new name because you have to because of the savagery of the torture, they called me Faziwa. Every day they used to beat me and make me say, I am a woman and my name is Faziwa. You want me to forget all that and go on living? I'm not afraid of death anymore. I've made up my mind to be a martyr. Now, this is, again, it's a novel, but note that in the novel, far from breaking the victim, the sexualized, feminizing torture described transforms him from a peaceful participant in protests to a violent revolutionary. Quote, after this, a desire so burning that his body almost shuddered with the pressure would sweep over him as he hankered for revenge and pictured himself exacting exemplary punishment from those who tortured and violated him. Now, the last thing I want to leave you with is a dramatic contrast. I've previously done work on the way another gender performance requirement of the U.S. military, in some ways very different, in other ways eerily similar, one promulgated before the official pronouncement of the war on Islamic terrorism. And this is the case of Lieutenant Colonel Martha McSally, who, while she was a U.S. Air Force pilot stationed in Saudi Arabia at around the turn of the millennium, brought a constitutional lawsuit against the U.S. military because it required her, while off base in Saudi Arabia, to veil fully in an abaya, which is the all-encompassing garment that's the Saudi instantiation of hijab, or modest covering of women's bodies, to be accompanied at all times by a male whom she was instructed to say falsely was her husband. To be clear, this was not a requirement of the Saudi government. It was also not a requirement imposed on non-military U.S. female personnel, such as State Department women, who satisfied the Saudis with a small headscarf, and no comparable requirement was imposed on U.S. military men, who were prohibited from wearing local dress, whereas McSally was required to. McSally ultimately got the U.S. Congress by voice vote to overturn the policy, largely out of sympathy for her as a poor Christian woman forced to present herself in Muslim dress. Very little attention or vocal sympathy was given by members of Congress to her equally heartfelt, equally strong claim that the U.S. military's requirements for violated her U.S. constitutional rights to equal protection on grounds of sex, because it not only treated her differently, but it did so in a way that was going to undermine her command authority. I think the contrast, which is in some ways not so great a contrast, between respecting and accommodating Muslim sensibilities concerning the proper behavior of women in the one case, and deliberately exploiting and violating those sensibilities in the other, adds up to a systematic subordination of women by the U.S. military, as well as, again, to a reinforcement rather than an undercutting of stereotypical Muslim assumptions about women and about their place. Thanks.
Yeah, I thought this was wonderful. And I guess what I think is so difficult and troubling about these cases is that the humiliation and the whatever it might be close to torture is mediated by stereotypes that we might think are unbalanced, mistaken, and very pernicious. So let me give you, so then the question is how to bring out what's wrong, if anything, about being made to put on some women's underwear. So let's focusing on that thing. So let me give you some parallels that all involve a Brahmin man being asked to clean the toilet, okay? So the first case, Gandhi says to this man, okay, unless you clean a toilet, you can't be in my movement. That man or woman would feel it is profoundly humiliating. And we know his wife did feel it that way, and it will be a torture. But nonetheless, it seems like a very productive humanitarian act. Okay, second case, like in today's Indian prisons, Brahmin men are told clean your toilet. They have to do it like anyone else. Once again, that seems like a pretty good egalitarian act. Untouchability is illegal under the Constitution and so on. So then, third case, the jailer is actually a Dalit and says, you know, I really don't like Brahmins, and I'm going to really humiliate you by making sure that you clean more toilets. Well, I guess even there, I think, well, there's this added increment of revenge, but still, what he's making him do is connect with his common humanity and accept that.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't seem like even the intent to humiliate makes it bad. And so I guess I'm left with thinking, what makes it bad? So here would be a case where we say, you clean that toilet, and we're doing that because we think people who clean toilets are just like animals and they're lower than other people. So it's that way of representing the act of toilet cleaning that's what makes it bad. But if that's what makes the female bad, namely the way it's represented as something low or bad, then that suffuses the whole of society. It isn't common to these practices. It's like everywhere. And so then the question is, what's specially wrong about being made to do it in this particular social context? It's really the whole society that we need to be attacking.
I don't disagree that it's the whole society we need to be attacking. So but I also want to distinguish. I mean, I thought you were going to take me in a somewhat different direction in your question, which is a direction I haven't really addressed here. So another set of distinctions, or the distinction between the practices I did discuss, which come from frat hazing and are about deliberately making men feel degraded because they are being feminized, right? That seems to me is something that, on the one hand, we as a society, as a matter of constitutional law, repudiate. On the other hand, it does not depend on the special difference of Muslims, right? American men feel this way in the same way as Muslim men do. What I find actually complicated in a different kind of way, and haven't talked about here because I haven't thought through as thoroughly, is what about examples of practices that particularly Muslim men would find degrading, but to accommodate them in this would be a huge setback for our commitment to sex equality, at least in my view. So as you know, I've just written a paper critiquing our colleague Dick Posner's claim that it constitutes, in a dissenting opinion, I'm happy to say, that it would constitute cruel and unusual punishment to subject an inmate in an American prison, not a Muslim inmate, actually a Christian inmate in an American prison, to the possibility that women might see him naked on the toilet or in the shower. And I say that, you know, very bad idea of, you know, and I agree with our other colleague Frank Easterbrook that if the alternative, as it's conceded to be, would be that these people would have no contact with women whatsoever, that not only would be worse for women's equal opportunities, but in my view, worse for, you know, it would be more treating them like animals, which is what Posner says happens, to isolate them from women entirely than to put them at risk of women seeing them naked. Now, if the prisoner had been a Muslim, the existing law would actually have given more support to the cruel and unusual punishment claim because, as I understand the law of cruel and unusual punishment, singling people out for their particular vulnerabilities. But are you singling them out for their vulnerabilities, or are you simply imposing a practice on them that you impose on everyone? And part of the problem is that in Abu Ghraib, it seems that the intent was to single them out. And some of the time, at least, and some of the rest of the time, it wasn't. That is to say,
talk about religiously based accommodations.
Yes.
I was trying to stay away from that and just think of a practice that, because of social norms, is felt to be humiliating, but the nation has already committed itself to saying that's not humiliating. So then, what's wrong with doing that? That's the really
well, but I think that there, the case law of humiliation and the European Court of Human Rights has a fairly rich description of that. Will work with that difficulty reasonably well, so that, you know, that the cases about whether it's humiliating to be beaten in a British school, right? So there's a whole lot of debate among the judges about whether it is or isn't humiliating to be beaten in a British school. But ultimately, the court says just, we're not going to get into that level of cultural nicety. We're going to take as a given that this practice is humiliating and categorically ban it. And I don't think that there's a problem with acknowledging especially since, for me, in a sort of consequentialist way, the argument that it's humiliating and to the men, and the argument that it's destructive of sex equality, dovetail in the result that the practice is banned. It would be a more complicated situation than if the humiliation, if acknowledging that it was humiliating would not lead to the same result as acknowledging that it's denigrating to sex equality to think of it as humiliating. Yeah, I would love to do that.
So I see 1, 2, 3 in the back.
Yeah, I think this is a great paper, and I would sort of summarize it as like reverse Geneva, which is it mentions you want to treat other people as well as your own soldiers. This is the soldier version where you can't treat people worse.
It's like this here.
So it's kind of a reverse Geneva, but I'm also really troubled by this because it does seem different, and it does seem to be intended to be different in the way that some are treating these folks about the training, I think. And so the question is, what's different about it if the actual conduct is the same? And this is where it's sort of useful to look at the resistance of Soviet dissidents. So after the Brezhnev Constitution went into effect in 1977, there were all these public displays of support for the Constitution. So the dissidents got this idea that what they should do is stand in public squares and read the Constitution aloud. That's right. Okay? Now, it was really, it messed up Soviet disciplinary practices. You can't arrest someone for reading the Constitution aloud. On the other hand, everyone knew that because it was them, these particular people who did it, right, that it meant something else.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if that isn't the kind of dynamic going on here, right? Which is the conduct is formally the same, which is why it looks like you couldn't punish these soldiers for doing that. But everyone knows that it means something else when done to those people like this, right? So in other words, it's in some ways either intentionally by these soldiers or in your analysis that you sort of assume the equivalence of the actions, when the actions are formally the same across different status groups. But I think there are lots of cases like this where in some ways doing it to, or having someone do something themselves comes to mean it's opposite or something different, even though it's formally the same.
No, I don't disagree with that, and I'm sort of intending this paper not to be a refutation, but a supplement to that line of analysis, which is the more customary line of analysis, and to do a couple of things here, right? Both to stress that it's not just about the other, and that oversimplifies it. Another, which I did not actually mention in the paper I delivered, but in light of the work that Darius has done, for example, I think also worth mentioning, it shows the limits of the torturer's imagination, right? So where do you get things, right? Both the limits of the torturer's imagination as to practices and the limits of perhaps also the limits of the torturer's imagination as to reactions to practices. So it's not hypothetically imagining how someone very different from you is going to feel about something that if it were done to you, it wouldn't bother you in the least. It's, you know what's going to work. Why do you know what's going to work? Not because you've read the Arab Mind, but because you've experienced it.
Yeah, I will reiterate compliments. I really appreciate it because I was waiting for someone who could bring in the perspective of gender roles in this issue, because it seems to me quite relevant, and at least in two ways. Because I think your analysis shows not only the intent of humiliating the detainees, but I think that it fits well with the idea that torture is about dehumanizing, or at least rendering different, lower, alien from me, the person you torture. So at the same time, somehow these two purposes reinforce each other. So you can torture, humiliate better someone who's conceived as different, and you humiliate them through making them lower in some manner, however. Because most of the time people who torture are, as a matter of fact, not necessarily something good about women. And the second thing is that I think this also fits well in the idea that this is also, this has been a bit brought about, this idea that if you resist torture, you're tough. So like torture is a matter for tough men.
Yeah.
People who do them are tough, and the few who can resist are tough, and they're manly. And I think this is also like interesting, like it's again, it highlights one of the many myths of torture, because it seems that if there is one thing that women are good at, is resisting pain. And so that should be actually, I mean, it's praised as a feminine feature, at least in which they are as equally good. So I think that this perspective of gender roles is really fertile.
Thank you.
Well, I wanted to get a little bit into sort of the formal path for these techniques and how that came about.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that.
Into the formal path of the techniques, how they came about. Because, of course, I guess, the public sort of saw them in Abu Ghraib first and was told, Animal House, Laura Rush Limbaugh talking about frats, etc. And then I think the next really shocker was when Mark Schmidt issued his report about Guantanamo, and we saw photographs of exactly the same techniques, and the report says, no, this is a fully authorized practice under Pride and Ego Type 2 down. So suddenly people went like, what? So that suggests, well, I guess it suggests that, that there clearly was a process of formally elaborating and developing these techniques and training people to use them. And then there was also an aspect of the free form about it, that people were told, feel free to improvise and modify a little bit here and there to produce something that's effective. So I guess I'm getting down to, where was this laboratory when they came up with these things?
You would know better than I do.
They really obscured that.
My sense is that there isn't one, right? So you've read, I'm sure, the same first-person accounts of the interrogators, and the feel I get from there is the feel of, again, consistent with what Darius was saying, it's improvisation. I mean, it's not even at the level of craft. It's improvisation by people who are untrained, and some of them know it, and some of them imagine that they're more trained than they are. But it's not. I don't think it's as systematic. I mean, I do think
there is sort of a broad guideline authorization.
But there is a directive from the very top: be harsh. We like harsh.
Take the gloves off.
Yeah.
Is there, in fact, a distinction at Abu Ghraib, for example, that one group of people are supposed to break them down, but somebody else is actually asking the questions?
Absolutely.
And how does that work?
That's General Taguba's report. I mean, General Taguba's report said that the role of the police was to break down and prepare them for the interrogators.
And then the interrogators, it's a whole different set of...
Yeah, but then there's also this dynamic, which again, Scott probably knows more than I do, because I'm still lost in the echo chamber or the Hall of Mirrors, right? Is that there were sort of two different lanes of thought among interrogators that may have divided in terms of their institutional affiliation. And there's account after account where there's a tension between one group of interrogators who say we were getting really far with the feminine methods. Well, you might call them traditional, but I'm going to call them feminine. Again, that in the sense and then there was some decision to go harsh, and our progress was thwarted by this other group who came in and was harsh and then took credit for stuff that we did and got nothing themselves and spoiled what good we were doing.
I've been told by our organizer we have to stop at this point, but I know that both Marian Case and Scott Horton are going to be here during the break. We will take a break until 10 minutes. We get 10 minutes. Thank you.